Welcome to our next session. I'm Tamás Erdődi and this is the Modern Artist Club Start to Paint Your Way. What consistencies we can achieve with the gouache. So for that we don't need the best paper you have. So if you have a scrap paper or maybe just a mixed media paper, start with that please. Let's prepare the gouache colors. First I like to use a color what I'm not a huge fan of, so it's not a big waste if I'm wasting it, so I'm looking for a color what I rarely use. Of course, usually I'm using the ultramarine blue, but maybe the darker Prussian blue could be a great color for this. Exercise is going to be just swatches and to see how they act differently. So if you have a color what you are not a big fan of, use that instead of your favorite one for this starting exercise. Let's start with the thickest application. For that I will need a brush and of course the water. Thickest application, basically when we have just a minimal amount of water and maybe just wet the brush a little bit, but don't have it really running, just a tiny bit, so the paint will not go into the bristles. And we have this first consistency, which is the straight out of the tube. This is the most thickest application where we basically use a minimal amount of water and maybe no water at all. We rarely use this consistency, but it's great for comparison. What I see on the edge basically is a little bit of texture from the brush itself, and this is the buttery texture, and from here we can go to the next consistency where we add a little bit of water. The first two are not really a huge difference, but when we start to mix, for example, colors, they can be visible that we have a little bit of difference between the two. And when things can get exciting is when we arrive at the milk consistency. For that I will place mark so you can see how much it covers. It might depend on your color, if it's a transparent color or an opaque one. Between the colors we have some which are a bit more transparent by itself, so you can find little marks usually on the tubes. Light yellow color is much more transparent than the darker shades. Okay, so this was the milk consistency. We start to add a bit more water. That way we can get more transparency. And how much water we add is really depends on the situation. This could be fine. This is the coffee. And lastly, we arrive at the more watery version, which is the tea. The difference between these can be really subtle, and of course we can have maybe nuances between them. Their consistency could really nicely work when we need to add a light layer on top of an already painted area, for example. So that's why it is really important to understand how we can manipulate the paint. Of course we can go even lighter than the teal or tea with a, let's see, just for the reference. This is even lighter. From the preparation paintings, I was able to achieve this soft gradient with adding lighter washes in the end. So that's why it's really helpful to understand how your paint behaves and what you can achieve with adding more water. And of course, the butter consistency, or some call it like honey consistency, could be achieved with the palette knife also. So if I will grab a little paint with my palette knife, this is of course a really dry application, or really without water. So that's why we can create really harsh areas with a palette knife, because we can cut, for example, a nice reflection or maybe a bark texture. Palette knife is better for these harder lines, and you can't really achieve softness. Maybe if you have more paint, and that way you can create nicer blends with the palette knife. If you have white paint next to the blue, of course they will mix together, and you can create a marble effect, blend them together really nicely. Yeah, this could be the palette knife. Why this paint difference could be interesting is with the sponge, I like to use a bit more watery paint. So with a bit more water, we can create, let's try to make a mark with the sponge. So if I'm using only the corner of my sponge, I can create really nice line. And what I found really interesting is when the paint is getting a bit more dry, or maybe I will mix a bit of paint, a bit more colors or tones together, and we can create really nice transitions with this sponge. So let's grab a little bit of white. One thing it's worth mentioning, please try to use one side of your sponge, because in a second you will get so messy that you need to clean up the mess. So yeah, but if you are careful with what you are touching, you can keep it less messy. Okay, and how we can blend is using different movements, and depending on your sponge, you can create transitions between the areas. For the sponge technique, we need a bit more paint than usual. As a side note, it requires a bit more paint, but usually I like to use more paint instead of trying to save it for the future, because there's no wasted paint. That's how I like to think about it. Maybe wasted moments, but with every experiment we can learn something and maybe experience something. So yeah, don't think about the wasted paint. That's why the gouache is especially interesting, because with acrylics, when the palette is dry, you know, you need to throw that paint away. But even at that point, I like to, for example, use the leftover paints and maybe just create a base layer for a next painting, or just some experiments. So I have a bunch of these experiments, and I feel that at one point they could become something. So don't be afraid that you will waste time or waste paint. It's better to use them. I feel that maybe this page could stay as a reference, so I maybe just add the sponge text, and this could be just as a last. Of course, we can go as light as we want. Yeah, we can basically control the amount of paint with the amount of water we add. We had an earlier session, you can find this in the recordings or the replay vault. We played with watercolors and how we can manipulate the edges and create soft transitions with adding water and maybe blend edges just by adding water, and even how we can blend with the wet on wet technique, and is the same with the gouache. That's why it's a really versatile medium that we can use similar techniques to create these nice blends. And I feel that with any kind of subjects, we can use this blending technique to create a soft gradient even in the sky, or if it's a water, or maybe just transition between the light side or dark side. So it's really handy to experiment with how you can create these blends and go from the hard edge to the softer edges. Painting is all about finding the balance between the hard edges and the soft edges, and how we can basically manipulate them and tell the story with focusing the attention with the hard edges or contrast to the focal area, and how we fade away from that to the less important secondary areas inside the painting. Okay, and this is the watery application. Thank you very much for joining, and I hope you experimented with the same techniques, and please share your creations under the post, and see you next time. Happy painting. Ciao.